Hi there. Before we get started, just by a show of hands, how many people here either support themselves or would like to support themselves, at least partially, by selling apps in the App Store? Good. You're my people. Welcome to an Indie's Guide to Building Profitable Apps. My name is Charles Perry, and I'm the owner of Metakite Software. I was able to go indie with Metakite Software in 2012, so actually I just celebrated my 4th anniversary as an indie, so I'm really excited about that. In addition to that, I'm also the co-host of a podcast called Release Notes, which, as the tagline there says, is a weekly conversation about the business of indie software development. Now, I mentioned that not to suggest that I know more about the business of indie software development than any of you do, because some of you undoubtedly have more successful businesses than I have. But it does mean that I have to think a lot about the business of indie software development. I have to think about how what's going on in our industry today applies to our business as independent software developers. So I read a lot, I think a lot, I try to do some analysis, because I've got a podcast that's got to go every week, and I've got to have something interesting to say. But it also gives me the opportunity to come to conferences like this and talk to people like you. And in those conversations, one of the things that keeps coming up over and over again is, as we just saw, there's a lot of people out there that really want to go indie. There's just something about the idea of being able to support yourself by selling your own products without taking outside funding or venture capital that really appeals to a lot of people. But it's not easy. It's certainly harder than it once was. We all remember stories of the golden age of the App Store where you could throw just about anything up on the App Store. And if it was high enough quality, you stood a pretty good chance of being able to support yourself. That's certainly not the case today. Today there's more competition than ever. It seems like every niche is filled. And customers seem less willing than ever to be able to spend money on software. Apps, we all know about the race to the bottom. Apps that once went for $10 today go for 99 cents, or probably even free. But there are things that we can do in order to improve our chances of finding success in the App Store. In fact, I was just reading a book recently called Start Small, Stay Small, A Developer's Guide to Launching a Startup. And it's by a guy named Rob Walling. Now, you may have heard of Rob Walling. He's mostly a web entrepreneur, and this book was about web entrepreneurship and web products. But there was a lot in this book that really transferred, I think, to our experience as mobile developers. And in it, one of the things he pointed out is that there are really 4 main success factors that contribute to the success of a software business. And they are market. What are you selling? Who are you selling it to? How willing is your market to part with their money in order to get software? 2, marketing. How well can you communicate the benefits of your software to the customer? 3, aesthetics. How pretty is your app? What does it look like? Does it look like it belongs on iOS? And 4, functionality. What does your app do? And how well does it do it? And so we have these 4 key success factors that Rob Walling introduced. But his key insight wasn't that there are 4 success factors that contribute to the success of a software business. His key insight are that these 4 success factors contribute unequally to the success of a software business. And that, in fact, market, more than any other factor, is the one thing that will contribute to the success or failure of your software business. And so if we accept that market is the most important factor in your software business, and I believe that it is, then it makes sense that we as indies concentrate on what is most important, that we concentrate first on market. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, something that I call market-first development. And in market-first development, there we go. And in market-first development, what we're talking about is a process that we can use in order to increase our chances of finding success in the App Store. It's not a guarantee, nothing is, but with market-first development, by concentrating first on what's most important, we can really improve our chances of finding the success that we desire. Now, before we do that, we probably need to talk about what exactly I mean by a market. Now, when we're talking about market, we're really talking about 2 things. We're talking about what you're selling and who you're selling it to. And so market then is the sum. It's the sum of the audience and your product. For example, let's say you have a product you want to sell, a word processor. And you want to sell that product to, let's say, a medical office. So you're going to make a word processor that is geared towards medical offices and is going to be marketed to medical offices. That's a market. But take that same product, sell it to a different audience, say, the academic field. You're going to sell it to professors and grad students working on their thesis. Now you have a different audience, so you have a different market. And so this is a distinction I want you to keep in mind as we're talking through today. But if we're going to concentrate on market first, if we're going to concentrate first on picking the best market for our software, we have to start with the equation here and start with our audience. So in order to start with our market first, we first have to choose an audience that we want to sell our software to. And so to do that, we first need to brainstorm some ideas. We need to come up with all kinds of ideas of who it is we might want to sell our software to. And hopefully we're going to pick an audience that's willing to spend money. Now, the idea of choosing your audience, choosing your customer is not a new one. In fact, it's a pretty old idea, and I think it's a pretty powerful one. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Now, when you're brainstorming ideas for choosing your audience, there's lots of different ways of doing it. There's no one right or wrong way to do brainstorming. But one way that I used to suggest is that you think of ideas for your audience that revolve around 3 areas: hobbies, interests, and occupations. And the reason why I suggest that you start with this is because this is where people like to spend money. They spend money to do things that they enjoy, or spend money on their business so they can be more profitable. But unfortunately, the App Store is a pretty hard market, and it's become clear over, I think, many years that it's hard to convince customers to part with their money. And in fact, it's particularly hard when it's just for enjoyment. And so unfortunately, I no longer actually suggest that you look at hobbies and interests. I think it's a really hard sell. And instead, I suggest that you concentrate most of your efforts and choose an audience that's based on an occupation. Now, that's not to say you can't make money by selling to an audience that's based on an interest or a hobby. You certainly can. I just think it's much easier if you choose an occupational-based audience because the value proposition that you can offer is much more clear-cut. With an occupational audience, you can say, look, you can buy my software for $20 or for $100. And in exchange, you're going to become more productive, you're going to be able to get your job done easier, and you're going to make $500 or $1,000. That's the kind of value proposition that any business owner can really wrap their head around. So we've brainstormed a list of audiences, but of course, we're indies. We're just one person holding down the fort. We don't have enough time or enough energy or enough resources to be everything to everyone. We've got to make a decision. We've got to choose just the one that we think is going to give us the best chance of success. And so we've got to narrow that down to just one audience. And to do that, we're going to need to do some evaluation. Now, when we're evaluating our audiences, there's a couple things that I think you should keep in mind as you're trying to decide which one it is that you're going to go for. First of all, can you reach the audience? Can you put your marketing message in front of the people you're trying to sell software to? It's awful hard to convince somebody to buy your software if they've never heard of you. And so you've got to look for a group that you can actually reach, and hopefully reach cheaply since we don't have a lot of money as indies. To do that, the best way, I think, is to find them online, frankly. If you can find the message boards and the blogs that they read, find out how you can get your message in front of them. If they congregate online someplace, that's an opportunity for you to get your message in front of them. Another opportunity that's particular to occupational audiences are professional organizations. If your particular audience has an organization that revolves around their occupation, some sort of a certification board or something like that, they may have conferences that you can attend, you can get your message in front of them. They may have newsletters that you can put advertising in. But that's another avenue for being able to get your message in front of your audience. Another thing to consider, can you actually understand the needs and wants of your audience? This is a little trickier than you might think at first. If you happen to be selling software to other software developers, congratulations, you have a pretty good understanding of what they need. But what if you're not? At some point, we've got to break out of the cycle of selling software to each other and bring in money from outside our own community. And when you do that, you very well might find that you're not actually part of the audience that you're trying to sell to. You might not have a great understanding of what it is the audience truly wants and needs. And so to sort of understand audiences that you're not actually a part of, you need to sort of branch out and use other resources that are available to you. For instance, do you have any friends or family that are part of this audience? If so, great. That's a mark in the favor of that audience because you can use them as a resource to understand what's going on right now. Or, as we mentioned before, if they congregate online, can you join their message boards? Can you join their forums and essentially spy on them? Figure out what's important to them right now, what problems they're running into. But some way that you can figure out what it is they actually need. Another thing to consider, is your audience of an appropriate size? Now, as indies, we're primarily concerned about choosing an audience that's actually too big, believe it or not. Because, and so as a result, I suggest that you guys concentrate on a niche. The reason I suggest that you concentrate on a niche is because if you choose an audience that's too large, you may find unwanted attention in the marketplace. You may find that if there's too much profit involved, that you have people or companies like Microsoft and Adobe and Apple coming knocking at your door, thinking about stealing away some of your product. So, think about it this way. If I told you that I had an idea for a product that I thought could bring in 250,000 euro per year in revenue, that's great. I'll take that in a heartbeat. That sounds like a fantastic product for me. But if you make that same pitch in the boardroom of Adobe or Microsoft, they're not going to be interested. They're going to laugh you right out the door. 250,000 euro per year won't even cover their engineering cost. And so by concentrating on a niche where there's not too much profit, you have the ability to drive away competition that you really don't want to go against. The result is that you'll end up competing against smaller firms, other indies, who have similar budgets for marketing and engineering, and it creates a more level playing field, one that you have a chance to win on. So we've got this list of audiences. We now have evaluated the audiences. We've chosen just one that we want to actually pursue. Now we need to turn our attention to the other side of the equation. We've got our audience. Now we've got to come up with a product. And to do that, we're going to have to do some more research. Now, there's many different ways to research your product ideas. One way that I think is particularly useful is put forward by a woman named Amy Hoy. And she has a method that she calls a sales safari. The idea is that you're going to go out and find your audience online. You're going to go to the blogs and message boards that they hang out on, but particularly you're going to pay attention to places where they ask questions. So you're going to go to Stack Exchange. You're going to go to Quora. You're going to go to the forums where they interact and ask each other questions. And when you do, no need to say anything. You're just observing. Look for questions that come up over and over again, but have really no good answer. Look for the problems that people keep complaining about that have no great solution. Those are your potential products, the ones that people recognize as a problem, but no one's come up with a solution yet. When you come up with a list of those, now you have some ideas that you might want to produce. If you want to take your research offline, you can go back to your friends and family who happen to be part of the audience that you pursued. Buy them a cup of coffee. Sit down with them. Ask them what their biggest problem is on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. But don't buy them coffee just once. Buy them coffee over and over again. Buy them have a standing appointment every week if you can convince them to. You want to develop a really good idea of the problems that are going on in their community, and you can only get that by having recurring conversations with people in that audience. If you have friends and family that are a part of your audience, they're a prime resource for trying to really come up with ideas for problems that need solutions. So at this point, you hopefully have some product ideas. Now, of course, you have to evaluate them and choose just one. Because again, we're indies. We can't be everything to everyone. We've got to choose the idea that we want to really invest our time and energy into, the one that we think has the best chance of finding success. But unfortunately, evaluating markets, the sum of an audience plus a product, is sort of a black art because there's a lot of biases. We have a lot of incomplete data that we're trying to make a decision with, and that's not always optimal. But I was reading another book recently called The Personal MBA, and it's by a guy named Josh Kaufman. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do. It's a pretty thick book, but it's jam-packed with information. It's very dense. One of the things that he talks about in the book is he actually gives a framework for understanding how you can evaluate different markets. He actually gives 10 different criteria that you can use in order to evaluate markets and try to make a decision about which one is best for you. The first one he mentions is urgency. How badly do people want or need a solution like this right now? Well, if a person needs a solution right now to a painful problem, they're likely to buy pretty quickly, and perhaps at a premium above what you think they might otherwise pay. Another criteria to consider, market size. How many people are buying a solution like this right now? Obviously, more people the better, right? up to a point. Again, you want to be wary of markets that are too large because you don't want to go up against some of those larger players that you don't have the resources to keep up with. But you do need to make sure that there are people who are actually looking for solutions like this right now. Pricing potential. What's the most that a customer would be willing to pay for this? Would they be willing to pay more than once? Those are two very intriguing questions, especially in iOS, where monetization is really a hot topic. We're all familiar with the problems of the App Store where people are reluctant to pay pretty much anything for software anymore. And so the question really does have to be asked, will they pay money for it? That's the first question, the base question for iOS. The next question is, how much will they pay? And that question of how much will they pay is just as important. Because as we're about to see, being able to charge more than 99 cents, perhaps $20, perhaps $100, perhaps multiple times, really opens up other opportunities for marketing that really aren't available at lower price points. And frankly, let's be honest, it's way easier to run a business when you're bringing in $100 per sale than it is 99 cents per sale. The second question I mentioned is, would they be willing to pay more than once, which is also an interesting question, because there's lots of ways to have recurring revenue in the App Store. You can have subscriptions, you could have in-app purchase. Traditionally, software people had recurring revenue through upgrade pricing. That's become more difficult in the App Store. It's not impossible, it is difficult, but somehow you've got to crack that problem of recurring revenue. I think it's almost impossible to run a software business today without some sort of recurring revenue. And I personally would not pursue any idea that I couldn't come up with an idea for recurring revenue, whether that is upgrade pricing, subscription pricing, in-app purchase, tip jar, something, I don't know. But somehow you've got to get money from your customers more than once to account for the value that you're providing to them on an ongoing basis. The cost of customer acquisition is another thing to consider. Now, hopefully you won't be on a street corner spinning signs like this guy is, but it does take time and effort to get new customers, at least usually. Now, when we're talking about customers that we're acquiring, we're really talking about two different kinds of customers. There are organic customers, which are people who are out there experiencing a problem, they desperately want a solution, and they find your product because they happen to search for the right term either on the App Store or on Google or someplace else. Now, that kind of organic customer is really valuable to you because you didn't really have to spend much as far as actual money in order to attract them. But as you're developing an idea, it's a little bit hard to understand how much organic traffic you might actually get. Now, there's a lot of companies out there that are they're happy to tell you that they have insight into the App Store that no one else has, and they'll sell it to you for a price. And they'll tell you how many people are actually searching for search terms that you might be interested in. I don't believe them. Apple doesn't share information with them. They don't share information with us. They don't share information with anybody, especially about the inner workings of the App Store. But one company who does have insight into search patterns and is willing to share it with their customers is Google. And so if you actually make use of the Google AdWords Keyword Planner, it's a tool that they make available to people who are looking to purchase AdWords ads, you can type in different keywords that are associated with your app and get an idea of how many people are actually searching for the keywords that might lead them to make a purchase of your software. And through that, search behavior is fairly standard, I think, and the behavior of searches on Google, I think, is a pretty good analog of searches on the App Store. So if people are searching for keywords on Google, well, it's a pretty good chance they're going to find you on the App Store as well. So that's the organic customer. The other kind of customer you might need to run into or might need to create is a manufactured customer. Now, these are the customers that you go out and actually create, probably through advertising. I was reading recently that the cost in advertising of generating one download of your app is about $4 US. Now, if you're only selling your app for 99 cents each, that's going to be a loss on every sale. And so that's why I mentioned earlier that being able to find a market that you can actually charge a higher price for, perhaps $20, perhaps $100, perhaps even more, is really critical to being able to generate the customers that you need to survive as a business. Because at the lower level, you really don't have the ability to spend money on advertising and marketing like you need to. But if you're able to come up with an idea that will support a higher price, and that's why I suggest you use occupational audiences, you have the ability then, you have options at least, for exploring different opportunities with marketing and advertising that just aren't available at lower price points. Another thing to consider, the cost of value delivery. How much does it cost you to be able to deliver the product that you're supplying to the customer? Now, if you're in the App Store, the answer to that's pretty clear cut. It's 30%, right? That's Apple's take on every sale. But what if it doesn't have to be? What if you pursued a Mac app that doesn't have to be sold through the App Store? Then you could use FastSpring to handle your sales. They only charge about 10%. That's like getting a 20% raise right off the top. But if you're on iOS, I realize things are a little bit more difficult because pretty much everything has to go through the App Store then, except for some things. Because actually, if you have some sort of web service that goes along with your app, Apple is more than happy to let you charge for your subscription through your own website and then activate a subscription through your backend server. In that case, Apple doesn't get a cut at all. And all that you're being charged is the 3% that Stripe takes for credit card processing. That's like getting a 27% raise right off the top. So if you happen to be in a situation where you have the ability to take your monetization off the App Store and move it to some other platform, I strongly suggest you at least consider that. Another thing to consider, how unique is your product? Now, this is another tough one. We've talked about the race to the bottom and how the price of apps have sort of dropped from $10 to 99 cents to free. And the reason for that is because, frankly, most apps in the App Store today are undifferentiated crap. They all do about the same thing within a particular category. My app does the same thing as his app, which does the same thing as her app. And when all the apps in a category do about the same thing, the only decision that's left to the customer is how little can they pay. But if you have the ability to come up with something to differentiate your product, to make your app different, to make it more valuable than the competition, now all of a sudden you don't have to just compete based on price. Instead, you can compete based on features as well. And you can demand a higher price for that. But then, of course, you've got to be worried about how quickly can the thing that differentiates you just be copied, right? Because if I come up with a great feature that nobody else has, what's to stop the guy next to me from being able to copy it? And now all of a sudden I'm not differentiated again. I've become a commodity once again, and I'm stuck competing on price. And so the other part of this equation is you've got to think about how easy it is for your differentiating features to be copied. Hopefully, in a perfect world, you have some sort of either legal or technological protection. You either have a copyright or a patent or a trademark that prevents other people from being able to use the feature that really sets you apart. If not a legal protection, then perhaps a technological protection. Maybe the problem is so difficult that people can't solve it in quite the way you did, or perhaps they're just not interested in putting in the effort that it takes to solve a problem like that. That's also another way to sort of protect the point that differentiates you and be able to keep your product different enough that you're able to compete and demand higher prices still. Another thing to consider while evaluating your products, your markets, speed to market. How quickly can you make something to sell? Now, this one's pretty straightforward. All things being equal, if you have two ideas and one of them is going to take 9 weeks to produce and the other one's going to take 9 months to produce, choose the idea that's going to take 9 weeks. The faster you have a product to sell, the faster you can get in the App Store, the faster you can start getting revenue, and revenue is the lifeblood of any company. Upfront investment. Now, how much do you need to invest before you have something to sell? Now, this is an interesting one because it cuts both ways. Now, traditionally, an upfront investment is viewed as a detriment. It's something that is an extra cost in order to create your product. After all, it's something you have to invest in order to reap any benefits from. But let's say you do have an app. Let me backtrack a little bit here because when we're talking about upfront investment, traditionally one of the things we're talking about are like manufacturing lines and factories and things like that in traditional businesses. But we're software, right? Well, all we need is a compiler and a laptop. So we don't really have all those costs. So this upfront investment really cuts both ways because although it is a little bit of an investment on our part, any extra upfront investment that's required is potentially a barrier to entry for the competition to keep some competition out. For example, let's say you have an app that requires some sort of certification or training in order for you to be able to produce. You need to get this training in order to better understand what's going on in your audience. Well, how many developers that you know are going to be willing to go to the time and effort and cost of pursuing this extra training to be able to produce the app they need to be able to produce? Maybe not many. Upsell potential. What secondary offers can you present your customers? Are there in-app purchases? Are there subscriptions? Are there app bundles that you can offer to your customer in order to be able to get money from them more than just once? anytime you have the opportunity to make these sorts of secondary offers, to extract basically more money in exchange for the value that you're offering them, the better off you are. Obviously, revenue, as I said, is the lifeblood of any company, and the more revenue you have coming in, the better off you are. Finally, evergreen potential. How much time and effort is it going to take in order to keep your product up to date and ready to sell? Now, in iOS, we all know that we have we have an update cycle that's on an annual basis. That with WWDC, we always have something new that needs to change with iOS. But some apps require more updates than others. Sometimes there's content that needs to be changed. And in those sorts of cases, you need to think about how that extra cost in maintaining your app is going to affect the profitability of your business. And so there we have 10 ways to evaluate a market, all in one screenshot, ready for you to take a picture of in case you didn't want to write all that down. But we have urgency, market size, pricing potential, customer cost, delivery cost, uniqueness, speed to market, upfront investment, upsell potential, and evergreen potential. And so now we have finally evaluated all of our market ideas, where we have the one idea we want to pursue, and now so finally we are ready to open up Xcode and get to work, right? Maybe not quite yet. Because we all are human, and we have the tendency to delude ourselves. We see something shiny and we want to pursue it. We have an idea that we think is going to make us a lot of money, and we just go chase after it. So instead, I'm going to suggest you introduce one last step, which is validating your market. Think about one final step to think about whether this market really is as good as we think it is going into it. Now, there's lots of ways to validate a market. First of all, we can try to validate the size of our market, make sure it's actually of an appropriate size to us. One of the best ways, I think, to validate a market is actually to make use of Facebook. We talked earlier about the keyword planner that Google offers. Facebook has an ad creator, which is really valuable as well. If you can think about your audience and think about who the ideal customer is for your product, the person's age, education, whether they have children, what their occupation is, what their salary is on an annual basis, Facebook gives you the opportunity to enter in all of this information, and it has a little sliding scale that goes back and forth between too broad and too narrow. And ideally, you want it somewhere in the middle. Well, since to a first approximation, basically everybody is on Facebook, if you can put in this information and see that there's an appropriate sized audience on Facebook, it probably means that there's an appropriate sized audience in the wider world as well. And so you can make use of Facebook Ad Creator to make sure that you have an appropriate sized audience for your product. Another thing to validate is this pain point that we're trying to address actually as painful as we think it is? And one of the best ways to address this is actually through surveys. We just mentioned Facebook Ad Creator. While you're on there, you might go ahead and finish the process and buy some ads and drive people towards an online survey that people can fill out to give you an indication of whether the problem you're addressing is really, truly as painful as you think it is. And also to see how excited they are. If no one's excited about the solution you're about to offer, maybe it's a hint that maybe it's not as good as you thought. But if you can see some excitement, that's an indication that you're on the right track. Especially on iOS, one problem that you probably need to do is to validate your audience spending. I mentioned before that there are a lot of people who use iOS who simply aren't willing to spend money. A lot of audiences that won't part with their money for software. You need to make sure that the audience that you're addressing really will. And so one way you can do that is see if they actually buy stuff. Go onto Amazon, put in some keywords that are associated with your audience. See if there are any physical goods that come back. If they're willing to buy physical goods, that's an indication they're willing to at least spend money. That's a good sign. Or you can go online and search for info products. Look for ebooks, web courses, webinars, things like that people in your audience might pursue. If they exist, if people are buying them, that's an indication that they're willing to spend money to further their education and to solve problems. That's a good thing for you as well. Finally, look for other software that's aimed at your audience. Maybe not exactly the same software that you're producing, but some software. Because if your audience is willing to buy software in order to solve problems, that's exactly the kind of people you want to try to sell to. Another way you can validate your market is to look at the competition that's already out there. If you enter this market, who exactly will you be competing with? Are there people out there who already have a product like this? If there's not, don't celebrate too much. That might be because there's no one wants to buy the product you're thinking of building. Some competition is a good thing. It demonstrates that there is a market for the product that you're trying to sell. It demonstrates that people are actually willing to spend money to solve this problem. At the same time, you want to make sure that you're not going up against the proverbial 800-pound gorilla. You want to make sure that the competition that you might be going up against are people that you're willing to compete with head-to-head. Finally, and this is probably the most powerful one, is to validate your idea through pre-sales. Now, I mentioned before that you should have an idea of who your ideal customer is. And this is going to take it one step further. Once you have an idea of who your ideal customer is, identify 10 examples of that ideal customer. Real people, real names, people you can point to and touch and say, yes, this person is my ideal customer. And when you do, pick up the phone and call them. Now, this is one of the advantages of having an occupational audience, is that people in occupations generally want to be found because they want to sell you stuff. So there's contact information for them. Make use of that contact information. Call them up. Tell them about the product you're proposing. See if they get excited about the solution you're offering. And if they are excited, ask for a payment. Seriously. Before you even have a product to sell, try to sell them the software. And in exchange, what they'll basically be doing is getting in early. They'll get early access to the product so they can solve their problems sooner than they would otherwise. But that also gives them a chance to influence the development and see and be able to offer their insight so that they can make sure that the product that they end up with is actually going to suit their needs. Both sides still win. But if you can find somebody who's willing to spend money on a product before it even exists, that is really, truly the strongest possible indication you have that you might be on the right track. And so, after validating, we're now finally ready to open up Xcode. We've made use of market-first development. We've gone through the brainstorming audiences, evaluating an audience. We've researched product ideas. We've evaluated those markets to finally come up with one idea we want to produce, and then we've gone through a validation step to make sure that we're not going to be wasting our time. Now, finally, we're ready to open up Xcode. We're ready to address those other 3 success factors: marketing, aesthetics, and functionality. We're ready to really nail those and come up with a product that we're proud to sell and that's really helpful to the customers that we end up selling it to. And so I hope you find this useful. I hope you find success. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Charles.
We're done?
Would you like to do some?
Whatever you want.
Do you guys have any questions for Charles? Yes, here we go.
I'm losing my microphone, so please excuse me.
Hello, thank you for the talk. It's very exciting. I just want to ask about the validation part. Like, how many people that willing to pay that we need to convince to, like, for example, I'm selling an apps for developers, and then I already asked few people that, and they will pay for it. But how many people that we need that make it like the app is validated? Is it like 500 or do we need to like have, like to imagine first we need $10,000 and then we try to find people who are willing to pay $10,000?
So let me make sure they have an understanding. The question is, how many people do we need to find to do pre-sales to? Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. There's no one right answer. Any answer I give you could be better if you had more people buying, obviously, right? You know, obviously you'd like everyone to buy without seeing buying up front. But in practice, the idea of the validation step is really just to make sure that you have an idea of your ideal customer, right? You know in your mind who it is you want to be aiming this towards. The validation step of pre-sales is really to make sure that the people that you think should be excited about your product actually are excited about your product. And the reason you're asking for money is because people will lie to you. They'll tell you they're really excited and that they're really looking forward to buying this product when they're really not. And so the only real way you know whether somebody is truly excited or not is whether they give you money. And so that's really what the pre-sales is for, is to actually prove to yourself that someone is willing to part with money in exchange for a product. Now, in practice, yes. And since you don't actually have a true product yet, you may just have a beta or maybe nothing at all, you may just have an idea. That can be hard to do. But if you have a really good idea that people get really excited about, you know, and again, this is all based on the assumption that we're going towards an occupational audience rather than a hobby or interest audience. If you have an idea that people really get excited about, that's an indication that you're going to have a lot easier job selling your software once you actually do have something to show.
But do you think friends count?
Do I think friends count? How much do your friends like you? No, I mean, your question is a good one because I mentioned in the beginning the reason you're asking for money is because people will lie to you. And the problem with that, friends and family, they'll lie to you even worse, all right? You'll tell them, explain an idea that you have, and they want you to feel good. They want you to be excited because they're your friend, they're your family. You're going to have to make a decision on your own, I'm afraid. In practice, in my experience, money talks. And so if they really are willing to spend money on a software, that might be an indication that they're excited about using it in their own business. That can be true, but at the same, friends and family are a very difficult situation because, they have other motives besides just their self-interest. They have the motive of strengthening the relationship they already have with you as well. So you got to sort of strike a balance there.
Okay.
Is that it?
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.